Is Xi Jinping posturing himself as a global statesman with a possibility of him mediating the Ukraine war? 2 years on, and US has finally appointed an ambassador to India, a country it calls its strategic ally. And the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank is now spilling over to Europe. A very warm welcome to World 360 with me, Akanksha Swaroop. First up, I bring you the headlines. Chinese President Xi Jinping to meet Russian President Putin on a 3-day visit to Moscow. Reports indicate a possibility of China mediating the Ukraine war. Xi's move arrives soon after China brokered an agreement between longtime rivals Saudi and Iran. The United States has finally confirmed the ambassador to India after a gap of 2 years. Eric Garcetti won a bipartisan confirmation despite a cloud of controversies. The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and subsequent losses due to a surge in interest rates batters global banking stocks. The 167-year-old Swiss bank Credit Suisse becomes the biggest name ensnared by the market turmoil. Israel's new far-right government's plan to overhaul its judicial system faces tough resistance from reserve forces of the country's military intelligence unit. The new legislation severely limits courts and lawmakers from removing an unfit prime minister from office. And massive drama has gripped Pakistan as the former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who is facing multiple cases, slams the Shahbaz Sharif-led government for planning his arrest and called it quote-unquote London plan. And let me begin with our top focus. Chinese President Xi Jinping will pay a 3-day visit to Moscow next week on Monday as the world watches on to see how will Beijing mediate peace between Ukraine and Russia. Now, the visit had been widely expected but was only officially announced on Friday, days after Beijing brokered a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Xi secured a norm-breaking third term as president of China. Chinese Foreign Ministry has described this trip as a visit of friendship, cooperation and peace. Now, the Kremlin, meanwhile, has said that a number of important bilateral documents would be signed during Xi Jinping's trip. China maintains that it has not supplied any weapons to Russia during the war and has stressed that its relationship with Russia was always legitimate and within the boundaries of international law. And in February last year, China and Russia announced a no-limits partnership and signed a series of cooperation deals when Putin visited Beijing just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. All this as the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin over his crimes in Ukraine, and this announcement happened on Friday.
秉持在乌克兰危机问题上的客观公正立场，为劝和促谈发挥建设性作用。
But that's not all. The Pentagon has released a video of the mid-air collision that happened between a US spy drone and a Russian fighter jet in the international airspace over the Black Sea. A Russian aircraft can be seen approaching the American Reaper drone, which operators say then had to crash into the waters of the Black Sea. Earlier, the US officials had described how 2 Russian jets first harried and dumped fuel on the unmanned vehicle before the eventual collision. The incident has prompted a rare direct call between military leaders in Washington, D.C. and Moscow, and both the sides ended up blaming each other. The chairman of America's Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, told reporters that Russian behavior is becoming more aggressive, and the Secretary of State Antony Blinken labeled it as reckless and unsafe. While on the other side, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has called America ignorant for neglecting the fact that Russia had established airspace restrictions in this area.
But there is a pattern of behavior recently where there is a little bit more aggressive actions being conducted by the Russians. We think we haven't completed our analysis as to why that's happening. And it wasn't just involving us. There was some incidents earlier with the British and some other nations as well.
Но они игнорируют полностью тот факт, что после начала специальной военной операции наши военные объявили соответствующие районы Черного моря, прилегающие к берегу в определенных местах, как районами, которые имеют ограниченный статус для использования любыми летательными аппаратами. И вот такое, я бы сказал, вызывающее игнорирование этого объективного факта, конечно, наводит на мысли о том, что американская сторона пытается постоянно искать какие-то провокации для нагнетания конфронтационных своих подходов.
So what do these latest developments mean for the war, especially with regards to Xi Jinping's upcoming visit to Moscow? I'm joined in by our guests, Fred Ware, who's a Russian affairs expert, also joined in by Mr. Edward P. Joseph, who's a foreign policy expert, also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. If I may begin with you, Fred, what's the sentiment in Moscow towards Xi Jinping's arrival and Beijing's prospect of mediating the war in Ukraine?
I think the Russians are really happy about China stepping up. It clearly is activating its diplomacy. It's a new stage, I think, in Chinese foreign policy, and they already have this one major diplomatic triumph to their credit, the apparently expanding relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which, I mean, I think in Moscow, they recognize that China's economic clout is being mobilized now for diplomatic purposes, which in general, especially since it challenges U.S. hegemony,
right,
is going to be welcome in Moscow. About the specific peace plan for Ukraine, maybe not so much. I think the devil is in the details, and there are no details in the Chinese plan. But in principle, the Kremlin spokesman said the other day, there are no circumstances, there are no Russian goals that can be achieved other than on the battlefield for now. So I don't think the Russians are going to be sitting down for peace talks under anyone's auspices anytime soon.
It's interesting you mentioned that. Edward, if I could bring you in on this, what is China's goal in mediating this war? And should Kiev be cautiously receptive to China's peace plan?
That's exactly the question to ask, because we don't really know what Xi Jinping's motives here are. On the one hand, it could just be pure PR. The intention of Xi Jinping and China to present itself as some type of a peacemaker when in fact it's supporting Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Now that's one motive. On the other hand, what we don't know is whether Xi Jinping in some way is now buoyed by this successful venture between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and maybe thinks of himself as some kind of global peacemaker. We can't exclude the possibility here of personal ego and the attraction of trying to be a peacemaker. Now, we have to remember, underneath this are China's strategic objectives, and they lie, of course, in Russia's camp and not with Ukraine and not with Ukraine's backers, of course, the United States and the European Union and NATO. And that's why President Zelensky needs to be careful. Please.
Right. Fred, keeping in mind the recent U.S. drone downing by Russia in the Black Sea, how do you assess Xi's show of support to Vladimir Putin amid escalating tensions between Moscow and Washington?
You can see the Russian point of view. They're fighting a war right there, and the Americans are rather brazenly spying. And they're going to, because they say they do, give their findings to the Ukrainians. So still, the Russians behaved in a dangerous and reckless way. And that's exactly the kind of incident that you could point to as a trigger for World War III. That's people who've been warning from the very beginning, and I'm one of them, that this could easily get out of hand. Some little thing that nobody could predict could just happen, and suddenly the Russia and NATO or the United States will be in a shooting war. Well, that's a real good example of how it could happen.
Right.
That Chinese balloon incident over the United States, perhaps less dramatically so, but another case where things that you never would have thought of suddenly become flashpoints.
All right. Edward, I'd like to close in with your thoughts. China's efforts are being viewed as a counter to the global leadership so far displayed by the United States. Should Washington be concerned?
Not really, not in this instance. It's really President Zelensky who has to be very careful. And of course, the United States needs to be careful because of that.
All right. Many thanks to you, Edward and Fred, for joining in on World 360. But that's not all that happened as far as the United States is concerned. The US, UK and Australia have unveiled details of their plan to create a new fleet of nuclear-powered submarines aimed at countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region. Under the AUKUS Pact, Australia is getting its first nuclear-powered submarines, at least 3 from the United States. The allies will also work to create a new fleet using cutting-edge technology, including UK-made Rolls-Royce reactors. And speaking alongside the UK and Australian Prime Ministers in San Diego, California, US President Joe Biden said that the deal was aimed at bolstering peace in the region. And he further stressed that the submarines would be nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed. Beijing has strongly criticized the significant naval deal. Its foreign ministry has accused the 3 nations, that is, that they are part of the AUKUS. Now, Beijing has accused them of walking further and further down the path of error and danger. China's UN mission had earlier also accused the Western allies of setting back nuclear non-proliferation efforts.
I want to be clear. I want to be clear to everyone from the outset, right off the bat, so there's no confusion or misunderstanding on this critical point. These subs are powered, not nuclear-armed subs. They're nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed. Australia is a proud non-nuclear weapon state and is committed to stay that way. These boats will not have any nuclear weapons of any kind on them.
The AUKUS agreement we confirm here in San Diego represents the biggest single investment in Australia's defence capability in all of our history, strengthening Australia's national security and stability in our region.
The UK is today announcing a significant uplift in our defence budget. We're providing an extra £5 billion over the next 2 years, immediately increasing our defence budget to around 2.25% of GDP. This will allow us to replenish our war stocks and modernise our nuclear enterprise, delivering AUKUS and strengthening our deterrent.
It's aptly named. There is very little specific about it anymore. Now the decision of the US to sell about 200 Tomahawk missiles to Australia and to maintain these missiles was certain to have China bristling, and of course it has, and China has warned of a growing regional arms race in the Pacific, which is a fact now already. This three-way deal between Australia, the US and Britain, or AUKUS as it is called, is focused on a common submarine force in the Pacific. Under the deal, Australian submarines would be nuclear powered, though not nuclear armed, but now the Tomahawks that the US has so far given only to Britain will give Australia ferocious new teeth in the ocean. China says the US has slipped the nuclear part of the deal through a loophole in the non-proliferation treaty.
Now, the United States President Joe Biden's close aide Eric Garcetti has been confirmed by the US Senate as their next ambassador to India. It's a key diplomatic position, by the way, that has been vacant for 2 years. Now, the former Los Angeles mayor's nomination had been pending before the US Congress since July of 2021. So it's taken them more than 2 years to finalize a US ambassador to India, which so far had been occupied by the charge d'affaires, which, as we all know, is not the ambassador position. It's a deputy to the US ambassador. Garcetti was not confirmed by the Senate in President Biden's first 2 years in office amid concerns by some lawmakers that the then then mayor, had not adequately handled allegations against a former senior advisor of sexual assault and harassment. But what does this mean for a split Senate, which voted unanimously on such a controversial figure such as Garcetti? Let's try and get in a sense of perspective. For that, I'm joined in by my guests, Calvin Dark, who's a Democrat strategist, and Corinne Clark, who's a Republican strategist. Both of them join me live from Washington, D.C. Many thanks to you, Calvin and Corinne. Calvin, if I may begin with you, knowing that the Democrats have been against Garcetti for long and he has views against the Indian government, not to forget the alleged links with China's CCP, why did the US president decide to go ahead with Garcetti's appointment?
Well, I think that Garcetti and Biden have a very strong relationship, and President Biden he understands the importance of our relationship with India. And so in choosing Garcetti, I don't think he chose him lightly. And I think that some of the issues that you bring up, that's what ambassadors are for, so that our countries can have these conversations, so that, if there are mischaracterizations that Garcetti has made, maybe he will learn what those are when he gets to India. Maybe there's something that India can share with the United States if there's something that we're doing that doesn't match with what India's values are in their foreign policy. But I think that Biden made the decision based on who we thought was the most qualified, because look, it shows you how much the White House was behind Garcetti, that they nominated him and then lobbied for him and then renominated him. I think it was over 600 days. So I think that's why the White House stuck behind him in the way they did.
And let me bring in Corinne. Corinne, why did some Republicans vote in favor of a controversial figure such as Eric Garcetti?
I think that was a surprising move from these senators. They wanted to see a quick confirmation, and maybe they see an ally in Garcetti that a lot of Americans don't see. I personally am not too pleased with the decision of those 7 senators, when even 3 Democrats actually split with their party to vote against Biden's nominee.
Right.
So to see so many Republicans go for a nominee that even the Democrats could not find solidarity in supporting is very surprising, and it is disappointing to me as a Republican.
All right, Calvin, why would President Biden choose a controversial figure like Garcetti for a strategic ally like India? Would US do the same with other allies in EU, UK, or even Japan and Australia?
Well, I think that that is exactly why the controversies did not end up killing the nomination of Garcetti, because I think a lot of the senators that eventually did vote for him realized that the relationship with India is far too important culturally, politically, economically, security-wise, and they recognize that it should not have taken this long to get an ambassador appointed and confirmed for such an important ally. So I think for that reason, some senators were able to look past some of the allegations and controversy surrounding it.
I'm sure Corinne begs to differ. Corinne, Garcetti has claimed that he would raise human rights issue in India and has spoken against the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act. He's also reported to have links with China's CCP. As a strategic partner to the US, shouldn't President Biden have appointed a person with a more spotless reputation?
Yeah, I really wish that I could ease concerns, but I think that it is completely reasonable to be skeptical of this ambassador now, and skeptical of this administration and their treatment towards strategic allies that are against China. I think this administration has proven several times that they're just not willing to stand up to China in the way that the previous administration has been. And this appointment of Eric Garcetti is more proof of that. And that is terrible. And I really wish that wasn't the case.
All right. Many thanks to you, Corinne and Calvin, for sharing in your precious views. Now, we are halfway through the first quarter of 2023, and the world just witnessed the biggest failure of a US bank since the global financial crisis was playing out in real time. 2 large banks that cater to the tech industry have collapsed after a bank run last week. The Silicon Valley Bank and the Signature Bank. The value of shares in some banks tumbled around the world after this collapse. Now, bank shares in the US, Asia, and Europe slumped as investors fretted about the general state of the banking sector. Amid the collapse, Switzerland is facing pressure from at least one major government to intervene on Credit Suisse, citing the systemic nature of the bank. The bank tapped the option of $54 billion loan from the Swiss National Bank. The emergency lifeline from the central bank has provided the embattled lender with only some relief, but the loan facility has only bought Credit Suisse some time to work out what to do next strategically to restore profitability. As the crisis seems unpredictable, rescue efforts have begun to save other banks from falling, like in a domino effect of the bank's collapse. Large U.S. banks have injected $30 billion in deposits into First Republic Bank, swooping in to rescue the lender caught up in a widening crisis. Policymakers have tried emphasizing that the current turmoil is different than the global financial crisis 15 years ago, as banks are better capitalized and funds more easily available. But central bank data also showed that banks sought record amounts of emergency liquidity from the Federal Reserve in recent days, driving up the size of the Fed's balance sheet after months of contraction. And with that, it's time to slip into a quick break here on World 360. But don't go anywhere. I'll be back with more global news and updates. Stay tuned.